Hello, and welcome back to another Pirkei Avot video text explication with me, Rabbi Drew. We are now on the fourth text in the fourth chapter of Pirkei Avot, and we have a double header. That's right, we have two different sayings from two different sages in this one text. So here's the first one. It's actually pretty brief. Rabbi Levitas ish Yavna. So this Rabbi Levitas, who is a leader of the town of Yavna, he says, Ma'od heve shval ruach shetikvas enosh rima. Okay, so he starts off by saying ma'od, very, very, like really doubly emphasizing what it is that he wants to say, which is what? Heve shval ruach. Be very humble. But that actually might almost be an understatement, because he's saying be incredibly very, like I would say very, very, or incredibly humble. Be very humble. Okay, so why is he advocating almost an extreme humility? Because he says shetikvas enosh rima, the hope, the aspiration of humans is worms. Really, that's just sort of the end. Ultimately, no matter what we're doing in our lives as human beings, ultimately, we will just merely become set in the ground with our corpses will merely be set in our ground upon our passing, and worms will consume us. This is fairly morbid. It's also incredibly depressing, I'm pretty sure, for anybody. I don't know how commonly people really use this as part of their own worldview, as far as their own way of thinking about and orienting themselves in their lives. Certainly, it is useful in having a real extreme humility. I don't know that anybody is. Maybe people are. Maybe people really are this humble. I don't know that I for certain, not everybody is. I almost wonder that who is his intended audience for this piece of advice? That's my question. I don't think he's saying it to people who already view themselves in a meek or humble way. I think he's really trying to tell this to people who have a very heavily inflated sense of self or ego. I think he's saying, calm down, folks. Don't think you're so high and mighty. You're just going to be with the worms eventually, just as all human beings are. So I think this advice, and again, this is just 100% speculation, I think he's really trying to direct this piece of advice to people who are lacking humility. He's saying you need to be very, very humble. I don't think he's saying this for people who have some sense of depression or a huge sense of meekness. Okay. Now on to the second statement in this fourth text in the fourth chapter. Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka. So Rabbi Yochanan, son of Broka, he says, Kol ha-machalel shem shemayim baseter nifraim imenu bagalui. So that's the first part of his statement. He has a second part. He says, everybody who profanes, anybody who profanes the name of heaven privately. So the name of heaven is another, it's an expression. It's another way of saying basically God, or giving honor to God, or Shem Shemaim, sort of the reputation of God, basically. Even privately, Nifra'im mimenu bagaloi, will be removed or not necessarily removed, but punished. This person will be punished publicly. So even though one might expect there might be a correspondence that if one does profane or otherwise denigrate Shem Shemaim, the heavenly name, or I want to say reputation, sort of like God's reputation. And I do have to explain, I realize I have to explain the expression Hamachal Shem Shemaim, which is, it's not just heaven's name, whatever that means. It really is more about reputation, God's reputation, and also the sense that for the rabbis, that when the Jews carry a certain sense of responsibility, almost like ambassadors for God and God's presence in this world. And when Jews are doing things that really do not put us and sort of more broadly God in a positive light, that it puts it in very much a negative and profane way, actually, in fact. So, hamachalo shem shemayim b'seiser. So even somehow defiling or otherwise just not necessarily belittling, but it's. I will say hamachalo chilul is the opposite of kaddish, of sanctifying. So that's really something that we're supposed to be doing. Mikadesh Shem Shemaim, and also ideally Mikadesh Shem Shemaim Bagalui, that Jews are sort of charged with this task of basically being ambassadors of God, and that we're supposed to be doing things that sanctify God's name publicly, sanctify God's reputation publicly. That's sort of the highest aspiration, and maybe less so would be, even in private, which would be good. And then you really want to avoid doing things that are hamachalo shem shemaim in public. But he's saying, this Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, even someone who is doing this privately will be punished in a public fashion. So that's definitely deeply unfortunate. Also, it's really fascinating because what does that do to the reputation of this particular person, right? Just as this person, whomever, or anybody who is profaning the divine reputation, even in private, this person's public reputation will be damaged and otherwise harmed. Okay. And then he qualifies this even further. He says, Echad shogeg ve'echad mezid b'chilo Hashem. And whether one is doing this inadvertently or one is doing this intentionally, it doesn't matter with Chil Hashem, with defiling, with denigrating the reputation or otherwise profaning the reputation of God. Certainly, as ambassadors of God, what Rabbi Yochanan, son of Broka, here is saying, it doesn't matter when you did this privately, and presumably even worse, publicly, if you were to profane God's reputation. This is true whether you meant to do it or had no intention of doing it. So I think the reason he's saying is intentionality doesn't really matter insofar as the person who's doing it, because ultimately it's about the results. And the result is that God's reputation is being harmed and otherwise made to be empty, when it's something that should be full of power and goodness in this world. So these are the two statements here, the two pieces of advice in the fourth text, in the fourth chapter. Definitely a couple of interesting things. We have, again, just to review, Rabbi Levitas, this leader in Yavna, advocating for an extreme humility. And we also have, because ultimately all of us are just going to end up in dirt. And then Rabbi Yochanan, son of Broka, advocating for a concern of even minding about having a sense of striving towards sanctifying the divine reputation, and also being careful even in private and even unwittingly, even accidentally doing something that would inadvertently result in a profanation of the divine reputation, and thinking of us as ambassadors to spread goodwill and goodness throughout this world. So that's what we got for this one, and thank you so much for watching.